The automatic gunfire shredded through the Mercedes like a razor through flesh. January 21st, 2004, Khabarovsk, Russia. Alexander Bilkov never saw it coming. The man they called Mirotvorets, the Peacemaker, had spent years mediating disputes between thieves-in-law, resolving conflicts that could have drowned Russia's Far East in blood. But on this frozen morning, his diplomatic immunity meant nothing. The assassins emptied their magazines into his vehicle, the bullets punching through metal, glass, and bone with mechanical efficiency. Bilkov died instantly, slumped in the driver's seat, his body torn apart by the same violence he'd spent his career trying to prevent. This wasn't a random hit. This was a message. And the man who ordered it was a former physical education teacher named Yuri Maslennikov. They called him Krab. The Krab. By 2004, that nickname carried more weight in Russia's Far East than most government officials' titles. When Krab gave an order, people died. When he demanded tribute, businesses paid. When he wanted someone gone, they vanished. But here's what makes this story different from every other Russian mafia tale you've heard. Krab didn't come from the traditional criminal underworld. He didn't grow up in the Soviet prison system. He never served time as a young man, never earned his criminal credentials through decades of incarceration, like the old-school thieves-in-law. Instead, Yuri Maslennikov was a boxing instructor with a degree from Khabarovsk Pedagogical Institute. He taught kids how to throw punches, how to condition their bodies, how to develop discipline and strength. Then he took those same skills and built one of the most brutal criminal organizations in Russian history. The journey from classroom to criminal empire began in the chaos of the early 1990s. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it didn't just take down a political system, it obliterated the entire social order. Suddenly, everything was up for grabs. State assets, industrial complexes, natural resources, smuggling routes, all available to whoever had the muscle and ruthlessness to seize them. In Khabarovsk, a city on Russia's far eastern frontier near the Chinese border, this vacuum of power created opportunities for men who understood violence. Yuri Maslennikov understood violence very well. Born January 9, 1967, in the village of Litovka in the Amur region of Khabarovsk territory, he'd grown up in the rugged conditions of Soviet Russia's frontier zone. Boxing wasn't just a hobby for him. It was a way of life, a method of survival, a language he spoke fluently. After graduating from the Pedagogical Institute's physical education faculty, Maslennikov started working as a bouncer at the Rus Cafe in Khabarovsk. This wasn't some friendly neighborhood restaurant. In the 1990s, cafes and restaurants in Russian cities were battlegrounds where different criminal groups fought for control of protection rackets, money laundering operations, and drug distribution networks. Working the door at Rus, Maslennikov saw how power actually functioned in the new Russia. It wasn't about ideology or party membership anymore. It was about who could deliver violence more effectively and who had the loyalty of enough armed men to hold territory. The physical education teacher learned these lessons quickly. His breakthrough came through a man named Viktor Kiselev, known in criminal circles as Kisel. An established Khabarovsk criminal authority, Kiselev recognized something valuable in Maslennikov: the ability to recruit and organize. See, the criminal world had a problem. The traditional thieves-in-law, the vori v zakonie, were mostly older men who'd spent decades in Soviet prisons. They had authority, they had the criminal code, they had respect, but they didn't have young, physically capable enforcers who could actually do the dirty work. Kiselev started recruiting athletes, boxers, martial artists, former military, to serve as muscle for his operations. And Maslennikov became his chief recruiter, bringing in fighters he'd trained or competed against, young men who needed money and weren't afraid of violence. This was Maslennikov's genius, the innovation that would eventually make him Krab. He didn't try to be a traditional criminal. He built his organization like a sports team, recruiting from boxing gyms and martial arts clubs, selecting men based on their physical capabilities and loyalty. These weren't street criminals with long rap sheets. They were athletes who could pass as legitimate citizens while simultaneously functioning as contract killers. The model was brutally effective. By the mid-1990s, Maslennikov had become Kiselev's right-hand man, his most trusted enforcer and organizer. Then, in 1996, Viktor Kiselev was murdered. The details of his death remain murky. Russian criminal history is written in blood and silence. But what's clear is that his elimination created a power vacuum, and Yuri Maslennikov, the former PE teacher, stepped into that vacuum. At just 29 years old, he became the smuggler for Khabarovsk, the overseer, the man responsible for coordinating all criminal activity in the city and surrounding territory. This promotion didn't come from his criminal pedigree or years in prison camps. It came from his organizational skills, his network of loyal fighters, and his demonstrated willingness to use extreme violence when necessary. The criminal organization he built became part of something larger, the Obshchak, which translates roughly as the common fund, or the pot. This wasn't just another gang. The Obshchak was a massive criminal network that controlled much of Russia's Far East through the 1990s and early 2000s. Think of it as a criminal corporation with regional divisions, each overseer managing their territory, collecting tribute from businesses, resolving disputes, and ensuring the flow of money upward to the thieves-in-law who sat at the top of the hierarchy. Khabarovsk was Maslennikov's division, and he ran it with the efficiency of a military operation. But here's where the story gets really interesting, where Maslennikov earned his nickname Krab. The Kamchatka crab, a massive, valuable crustacean found in the waters off Russia's Pacific coast, represented one of the most lucrative contraband markets in the region. These crabs are considered a delicacy in Asia, particularly in China, Japan, and South Korea, where they command premium prices. Legal crab fishing is heavily regulated, with strict quotas to prevent overfishing. But in the chaos of 1990s Russia, those regulations meant nothing. Whoever controlled the illegal crab fishing and smuggling operations controlled millions of dollars in annual revenue. Maslennikov's organization seized control of this market. His people worked with fishing vessels that operated outside legal limits, harvesting crabs in protected waters. They established smuggling routes across the border into China and through ports to Japan. They controlled processing facilities where the crabs were prepared for export, and they ensured that anyone who tried to compete in this market either paid tribute to the Obshchak or disappeared. The crab smuggling operation became so identified with Maslennikov that people started calling him Krab, the Crab. The nickname stuck, eventually becoming more widely known than his real name. When people in Khabarovsk's criminal underworld said Krab, everyone knew exactly who they meant. The money from crab smuggling was just one revenue stream. Maslennikov's organization also controlled the import of Japanese used cars, a massive market in Russia's Far East, where Japanese vehicles are preferred over domestic models. They ran protection rackets on legitimate businesses, operated gambling establishments, and managed drug distribution networks. They controlled the smuggling of timber to China, ancient forests stripped bare and shipped across the border with falsified documentation. Each business, each racket, each smuggling route fed money into the Obshchak, and a percentage came back to Maslennikov and his crew in Khabarovsk. By 2001, his power was formalized. Yevgeny Vasin, a major thief-in-law known as Jam, officially appointed Maslennikov as the smuggler for all of Khabarovsk territory. This wasn't just the city anymore. This was an entire region, an area the size of some European countries. Every criminal group in the territory now answered to Krab. Every dispute came to him for resolution. Every major criminal operation required his approval. At 34 years old, the former boxing instructor had become one of the most powerful criminal figures in Russia's Far East. But power like this requires violence, constant and unambiguous violence to maintain. And this is where Maslennikov's recruitment strategy showed its true purpose. Among the athletes and fighters he'd brought into the organization were men who became his personal contract killers, professional assassins who carried out executions on his orders. One of them was Pavel Tikhomirov, who went by the nickname Yeager, the Hunter. Former military, skilled with weapons, completely loyal to Krab. Tikhomirov became one of Maslennikov's most reliable executioners, the man you called when someone needed to die and you wanted it done efficiently. Another recruitment that would later become infamous was a father-son team, Pavel Demin and his son Yevgeny. The elder Demin was a boxer, like Maslennikov. He brought his son into the criminal world at a young age, training him not just in fighting, but in killing. Together, they formed a unique contract killing unit, a family business of assassination. This father-son hitman team would later inspire the main characters in the 2024 Russian TV series Likie, The Wild Ones, though the show changed their names to the Likovtsev family. Their story, a father bringing his teenage son into a world of organized murder, represents one of the darkest aspects of Maslennikov's organization. These weren't impulsive street criminals committing random violence. This was organized, professional murder for hire. When someone crossed the Obshchak, when someone refused to pay tribute, when someone threatened Krab's authority, they died. And they died in ways designed to send messages. Cars riddled with automatic gunfire in broad daylight. Bodies found in remote locations showing signs of torture. People who simply vanished, their families never finding out what happened. The violence wasn't random chaos. It was calculated terror, used as a management tool to ensure compliance and discourage competition. By 2003, Maslennikov's position seemed unassailable. He controlled a criminal empire worth tens of millions of dollars annually. He had a network of loyal enforcers and assassins. He had connections with corrupt officials at every level of regional government, police officers who warned him about investigations, prosecutors who made cases disappear, politicians who protected his operations in exchange for financial support. His children lived in Moscow, receiving expensive private educations far from the violence that funded their lifestyle. On paper, Maslennikov himself looked legitimate. No criminal record, no arrests, just a successful businessman with various investments. But underneath this appearance of strength, tensions were building. The traditional thieves-in-law, the old-school criminals who'd earned their status through decades in Soviet prison camps, were growing concerned about Maslennikov's independence. See, in the criminal hierarchy, a smotriashchi is supposed to be a manager, not a boss. He collects money for the Obshchak, the common fund, and passes it up to the thieves-in-law. He resolves disputes according to traditional criminal codes. He follows orders from above. But Krab was starting to act like he didn't need permission from anyone. He was keeping more money for himself and his organization. He was making major decisions without consulting the thieves-in-law. He was behaving less like an appointed overseer and more like an independent criminal leader. This wasn't just about disrespect or tradition. This was about money. Millions of dollars that the thieves-in-law believed belonged to them. The Obshchak's top leadership, men like Eduard Sakhnov, known as Sakhno, Oleg Samakin, and Oleg Shokirov, operated out of Komsomolsk-on-Amur, another major city in the region. These were serious criminals, thieves-in-law with full criminal credentials, men who'd spent years in Soviet prison camps and earned their status the traditional way. And they were watching Maslennikov with growing suspicion. The former PE teacher who'd risen so quickly, who'd built his organization from athletes rather than traditional criminals, who seemed to think he could operate independently, they saw him as a threat. In 2002, Sakhno received a significant endorsement. Aslan Usoyan, known as Ded Kasan, Grandpa Hassan, one of the most respected and powerful thieves-in-law in the entire former Soviet Union, blessed Sakhno as the primary criminal authority over Russia's Far East. This wasn't just a ceremonial title. This was Dead Kasan, a legendary figure in the criminal world, giving Sakhno the authority to enforce discipline and collect tribute across the entire region. And from Sakhno's perspective, Maslennikov was a subordinate who needed to be brought to heel. The conflict simmered through 2003. Maslennikov continued operating his empire, but he knew the Thieves-in-Law were unhappy. He'd made too much money, gained too much independence, built too much of his own power base. In the criminal world, this kind of autonomy is dangerous. The traditional code demands obedience to the Thieves-in-Law. When a regional overseer starts acting like his own boss, it threatens the entire hierarchical structure. Other overseers might get ideas. The flow of money upward might slow down. The authority of the Thieves-in-Law might be questioned. This couldn't be tolerated. But Maslennikov wasn't backing down. He'd built his organization from nothing. He'd recruited and trained his fighters. He'd established the smuggling networks and protection rackets. In his mind, he'd earned his position through work, not through sitting in prison camps reciting criminal codes. The tension between new school and old school, between earned authority and traditional hierarchy, between the boxing instructor and the Thieves-in-Law, this was heading toward an explosion. And that brings us back to January 21st, 2004, and the murder of Alexander Bilkov. Bilkov wasn't just any criminal. His nickname, Mirotvorets, the Peacemaker, came from his role as a mediator in the criminal world. When disputes arose between different criminal groups, when conflicts threatened to turn violent, Bilkov was the man who negotiated solutions. He was valuable precisely because he was neutral, trusted by different factions, able to find compromises that prevented all-out war. He owned the Karat hotel complex in Khabarovsk, a legitimate business that also served as neutral territory for criminal meetings. According to later court testimony and investigations, Maslennikov had been planning Bilkov's murder since 2003. The stated reason was complex, partly about business disputes, partly about Bilkov's connections to the Thieves-in-Law who were questioning Maslennikov's authority, partly about sending a message. The prosecution would later argue that Krab wanted to eliminate Bilkov to intimidate other figures in the criminal world and maintain his image as a harsh leader. But whatever the precise motivation, the order was given. Pavel Tikhomirov, the hunter, was given the contract. According to his later confession, Maslennikov initially assigned another killer, Nikolai Komkov, to execute Bilkov, with Tikhomirov serving as support. They spent months planning, surveillance, preparing weapons, establishing escape routes. This wasn't a spontaneous shooting. This was a carefully orchestrated assassination, planned with military precision. When they finally struck that January morning, they used automatic weapons, firing from multiple angles to ensure the target couldn't escape. Bilkov died in a storm of gunfire, his body shredded by bullets, his blood pooling in the frozen street. The Peacemaker, the mediator, the neutral party, executed with extreme prejudice. The message was clear. Krab didn't respect the old rules, didn't care about traditional neutralities, didn't fear retaliation. He was willing to kill anyone who stood in his way. But this murder was a catastrophic miscalculation. By killing Bilkov, Maslennikov didn't just eliminate a rival. He eliminated one of the few people who might have mediated a peaceful resolution to his conflict with the Thieves-in-Law. He showed that he was willing to violate the criminal code's prohibition against killing mediators. And he gave Sakhno and the other Obshchak leaders the justification they needed to move against him decisively. Within months, Maslennikov would go from being the untouchable overseer of Khabarovsk to a hunted man, whose family was targeted for elimination, whose organization was systematically destroyed, and whose only escape would be a betrayal so profound that it would destroy the entire Obshchak organization and reshape the criminal landscape of Russia's Far East. The retaliation came faster than Maslennikov expected. Spring 2004. Eduard Sakhnov and the other Obshchak leaders in Komsomolsk-on-Amur made their decision. Krab had to go. Not just removed from his position as Khabarovsk's overseer, destroyed completely. Stripped of everything he'd built, humiliated, and, if possible, killed. What followed wasn't a typical criminal dispute resolved through negotiation or a single act of violence. This was systematic warfare waged against Maslennikov and everyone connected to him, a campaign designed to erase him from existence. First came the formal stripping of authority. Sakhnov declared that Maslennikov was no longer the Smotriashchi for Khabarovsk. In the criminal hierarchy, this was the equivalent of a corporate board firing a CEO. Except, in this world, terminated executives don't get severance packages. They get bullets. To replace Krab, Sakhnov appointed a new overseer, a man loyal to the Komsomolsk Thieves-in-Law. The message was clear. Maslennikov's reign was over, his protection removed, his authority nullified. But firing him wasn't enough. The Thieves-in-Law implemented what's called raskulachivanya in Russian criminal slang, a term borrowed from Stalin's collectivization campaigns, when wealthy peasants, kulaks, were stripped of their property and livestock. In the criminal world, when someone is expelled from an organization, their assets become communal property to be seized and redistributed. Everything Maslennikov owned, houses, cars, businesses, cash, was now fair game for the Obshchak to confiscate. They started with the visible symbols of his wealth. His luxury vehicles were found burned to skeletal frames on empty streets, reduced to twisted metal and melted rubber. The houses he owned were raided, stripped of valuables, sometimes set ablaze. Business properties connected to him were vandalized or seized by new owners who appeared with armed backup. In a matter of weeks, millions of rubles in assets simply disappeared, redistributed among Sakhnov's allies, or destroyed outright. The message wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about humiliation, about showing everyone in the criminal world what happens when you defy the Thieves-in-Law. But Maslennikov's people, the fighters he'd recruited from boxing gyms and martial arts clubs, the men who'd made millions under his leadership, didn't all accept the new order. Many of them were loyal to Krab personally, not to the abstract concept of criminal hierarchy. His organization started to fracture. Some of his lieutenants went to Sakhnov's new overseer, Pasha Umatny, Crazy Pasha, and begged to be allowed back into the Obshchak. They abandoned Maslennikov, offering information about his operations, his hideouts, his plans, anything to get back into good standing with the new regime. The organization he'd spent years building was cannibalizing itself. Those who remained loyal to Krab found themselves hunted. Nikolai Komkov, one of the men who'd helped plan Bilkov's murder, was kidnapped by Obshchak enforcers. His body was never found. Investigators believe he was tortured for information about Maslennikov's whereabouts, then killed and disposed of in a way that ensured he'd never be discovered. This is standard procedure in Russian organized crime. Disappeared bodies can't testify, can't be autopsied, can't provide forensic evidence. Komkov simply ceased to exist. Maslennikov's personal driver vanished next. One day he was there, the next day, gone. No body, no ransom demand, no communication. Just another person erased from existence, probably dumped in the vast forests surrounding Khabarovsk, or weighted down in one of the region's many rivers. The systematic elimination of Krab's inner circle served both practical and psychological purposes. Practically, it removed people who might help him fight back or hide him. Psychologically, it demonstrated that loyalty to Maslennikov was a death sentence. Then came the violation that broke every rule in the criminal code, the escalation that proved Sakhnov's determination to destroy Maslennikov completely. They went after his family. In the traditional Thieves-in-Law code, the Ponyatya that supposedly governs criminal behavior, family members are off limits. You can kill your enemy, You can torture him. You can strip him of everything he owns. But his wife, his children, his elderly parents, these are supposed to be untouchable, protected by ancient customs that even the most brutal criminals supposedly respect. Sakhnov threw those rules away. Maslennikov's daughter, living in Moscow where she attended private school, became a target. According to later testimony, Obshchak operatives attempted to kidnap her, planning to use her as leverage to force her father's surrender, or simply to inflict maximum psychological damage. The kidnapping attempt failed. Whether because of security measures Maslennikov had in place or pure luck remains unclear. But the intent was there, documented in later criminal proceedings. A child targeted for abduction by professional criminals because of her father's defiance. His elderly parents, living quietly in Khabarovsk, found themselves in a war zone. Late one night, automatic gunfire erupted outside their apartment building. Bullets punched through their windows, shattering glass, embedding in walls, missing occupants by feet or inches. This wasn't an assassination attempt. If they'd wanted the old people dead, they would be dead. This was terrorism, pure psychological warfare, showing Maslennikov that nowhere was safe. No one was protected. His own parents, people who'd never committed a crime, who had nothing to do with the criminal world, were being shot at because of him. The terror escalated. His father, an elderly man completely uninvolved in criminal activity, was ambushed on the street and beaten by Obshchak enforcers. They didn't kill him, didn't even seriously injure him. They just beat him badly enough to send a message, to show that they could reach anyone in Maslennikov's family whenever they wanted. Imagine being a parent in your 60s or 70s, living through the collapse of the Soviet Union, trying to exist peacefully, and suddenly you're being targeted by organized crime because your son became a criminal boss. The cruelty was deliberate. Then they killed his nephew. Not threatened, not kidnapped, murdered him outright. The details of this killing aren't fully public, but the fact is documented in multiple sources. Maslennikov's nephew, killed by Obshchak assassins. Another family member sacrificed in the campaign to destroy Krab. This crossed every line. The Thieves-in-Law claimed to operate by a code, to have rules that separated them from common criminals. But this was terrorism against an entire family, punishing people for the crimes of a relative, tactics that belonged to totalitarian regimes, not supposed honorable criminals. While his family was under siege, Maslennikov was planning his own strike. If Sakhnov wanted war, Krab would give him war. August 2004. Highway between Khabarovsk and Komsomolsk-on-Amur, specifically kilometer marker 136. A Mercedes-Benz, the kind of luxury vehicle Russian criminals favored, traveling toward Komsomolsk. Inside, according to prosecution theory, was Eduard Sakhnov, the thief-in-law who'd ordered Maslennikov's destruction. The ambush was professional. Multiple shooters with automatic weapons positioned along the roadside. When the Mercedes reached the kill zone, they opened fire simultaneously, pouring bullets into the vehicle from different angles. The car was shredded, glass exploding, metal tearing, the driver losing control as rounds punched through the engine block. The vehicle came to rest on the highway, smoke rising from its perforated body, windows blown out, interior painted with blood. But Sakhnov wasn't hit. According to most accounts, he wasn't even in the car. The driver, a man named Kazakov, died in the attack. The passenger, Sergei Merkumyants, known as Sosed, the neighbor, who was himself a significant criminal figure, was killed. But Sakhnov, the primary target, survived. Whether he'd gotten intelligence about the planned attack and sent the car without riding in it himself, or whether he'd simply changed his plans at the last minute, the result was the same. The assassination attempt failed. This failure was catastrophic for Maslennikov. He'd committed resources to a major hit on a thief-in-law, mobilizing his remaining loyal fighters, obtaining automatic weapons, planning the ambush, and he'd missed. Now, Sakhnov had concrete evidence that Krab wasn't just defying authority, he was actively trying to murder a thief-in-law. This was the ultimate violation, the crime that justified any retaliation. The hunters became more aggressive, the price on Maslennikov's head presumably increased, and any possibility of negotiated settlement evaporated. Maslennikov ran. He fled Khabarovsk, abandoned his territory, left behind the empire he'd built. Moscow became his refuge, the massive capital city where he could disappear among millions of people, where Sakhnov's reach was less certain, where maybe he could survive long enough to figure out his next move. But running meant leaving his remaining organization leaderless. The fighters who'd stayed loyal started getting picked off. Sergei Kovalenko, known as Molodoy, the Young one of Krab's trusted lieutenants, was kidnapped by Obshchak operatives. They tortured him, trying to extract information about where Maslennikov was hiding, what resources he had left, who else remained loyal. Eventually, they kept him on a safe house, presumably planning to torture him more or use him as bait. Police found Kovalenko during a raid, malnourished and traumatized, but alive. His testimony later provided details about the systematic campaign against Maslennikov's organization. But others weren't so lucky. The bodies kept turning up, or, more often, didn't turn up at all. People connected to Krab simply disappeared into the vast emptiness of Russia's Far East. Forests that could hide 1,000 corpses, rivers deep enough to swallow weighted bodies, abandoned industrial sites where screams went unheard. In Moscow, Maslennikov faced a terrible calculation. He'd been one of the most powerful criminals in Russia's Far East. Now, he was a fugitive, hiding in a city where he had fewer connections, fewer resources, fewer options. His family was being terrorized. His organization was being systematically dismantled. His former allies were either dead or had betrayed him. The Obshchak controlled territories worth millions of rubles annually, had hundreds of enforcers, and had the backing of multiple thieves-in-law. Maslennikov had maybe a dozen loyal fighters left, limited funds, and enemies who would spend whatever it took to see him dead. He needed protection, real protection, the kind that could stand up against an organization like the Obshchak. And there was only one entity in Russia with that kind of power: the state, the police, the prosecutors, the same law enforcement apparatus he'd been bribing and evading for over a decade. Maslennikov had to make the choice that would define the rest of his life and destroy the criminal organization that had dominated Russia's Far East for a generation. He became a snitch, an informant, a cooperating witness. In Russian criminal slang, a krisa, a rat. The ultimate violation of the criminal code, the unforgivable sin. Sometime in late 2004 or early 2005, Maslennikov made contact with law enforcement authorities. The exact details of these negotiations remain secret, buried in classified files, but the results were clear. He offered to provide testimony against the Obshchak's leadership. He would detail their operations, name names, provide evidence that could dismantle the entire organization. In exchange, he wanted immunity from prosecution and protection for himself and his family. The prosecutors couldn't believe their luck. For years, they'd been trying to build cases against the Obshchak's top leadership. The organization was too well protected, too connected, too careful about leading evidence. Witnesses were terrified to testify. Physical evidence disappeared. Investigations stalled. But now they had an insider, someone who'd been part of the organization's upper management, who knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. Maslennikov was granted status as an osobo vazhny svidetel, a particularly important witness, a designation that came with immunity from prosecution and state protection. The deal was struck, and Maslennikov started talking. He gave prosecutors detailed information about the Obshchak's structure, its leadership hierarchy, its criminal operations. He identified specific crimes committed by specific individuals. He explained how the Obshchak common fund worked, how tribute was collected, how decisions were made. He provided testimony about murders, kidnappings, extortion schemes, smuggling operations. He turned over documentation, recordings, evidence he'd accumulated during his years running Khabarovsk. Most importantly, he gave them Edward Sakhnov, Oleg Samakin, and Oleg Shokirev, the three top leaders of the Obshchak. His testimony detailed their roles in organizing criminal activity, ordering violence, managing the organization. He described meetings where murders were planned, conversations where criminal policy was set, the mechanisms through which these three men controlled criminal activity across Russia's Far East. In 2005, based partly on Maslennikov's testimony, Russian authorities launched a massive operation. Raids across multiple cities, dozens of arrests. The Obshchak's leadership was taken into custody, along with many of their subordinates. Eduard Sakhnov, the thief-in-law who'd ordered Maslennikov's destruction, who'd sent killers after his family, was arrested and charged with organizing criminal activity. Television cameras captured the scene. Criminal bosses in handcuffs, loaded into police vans. Their era of impunity apparently over. The trial began in 2007 and stretched across 2 years. It was a massive proceeding, involving 11 defendants, hundreds of witnesses, thousands of pages of evidence. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Maslennikov's testimony. He took the stand and described the inner workings of the Obshchak in detail, explaining criminal operations that had previously been hidden behind layers of secrecy and violence. Other witnesses who'd previously been too terrified to testify now came forward, emboldened by seeing the organization's leaders behind bars. The defense spent enormous resources trying to destroy Maslennikov's credibility and dismantle the prosecution's case. According to some sources, the Obshchak's leaders spent nearly 300 million rubles, tens of millions of dollars, on legal fees and other efforts to derail the trial. They intimidated witnesses, bribed officials, filed endless motions. The trial was held in closed session due to security concerns. Jury members faced pressure and threats. Some witnesses recanted their testimony. The proceedings became a battle between the state's determination to convict major organized crime figures and the criminals' equally determined effort to avoid prison. But in May 2009, the verdicts came down. Guilty. The judges found Eduard Sakhnov, Oleg Samakin, and Oleg Shokirev guilty of organizing criminal activity, along with charges related to specific crimes including kidnapping and murder. The sentences were unprecedented. Sakhnov received 25 years in a strict regime colony, essentially a life sentence for a man already in his 50s. Samakin got 23 years. Shokirev received 20 years. Other defendants received terms ranging from 8 to 20 years. The Obshchak, the criminal organization that had dominated Russia's Far East for over a decade, was decapitated. The Supreme Court later reduced some sentences after requalifying certain charges. Sakhnov's term was lowered to 22 years, Samakin's to 20, Shokirev's to 17. But these were still crushing penalties that would keep these men imprisoned for the rest of their productive lives. And it had all happened because Yuri Maslennikov, facing his own destruction, had chosen to cooperate with the state. In the criminal underworld, Maslennikov's betrayal became legendary, a cautionary tale about what happens when personal survival trumps criminal code. Men who'd worked with him for years condemned him as a traitor. The term Krabovskia, the Krab's people, became an insult, a label for those who'd followed a rat. Some of Maslennikov's former subordinates who'd testified alongside him also received scorn, but Krab bore the primary stigma. He'd been the boss, the one who'd brought them all into the organization, and then he'd destroyed it to save himself. But here's where the story takes its most stunning twist. September 2009. Just months after the verdicts against Sakhnov and the other Obshchak leaders became final, prosecutors made a shocking announcement. They were stripping Yuri Maslennikov of his status as a particularly important witness. The immunity from prosecution that had protected him throughout the trial? Gone. And more, he was being declared a federal fugitive, wanted for prosecution. The charges? Organizing the murder of Alexander Bilkov in January 2004 and the attempted murder of Eduard Sakhnov in August 2004. The very crimes that had started this entire cascade of violence that had led to the war between Maslennikov and the Obshchak, that had resulted in him becoming a cooperating witness in the first place. The irony was stunning. Maslennikov had helped convict the Obshchak leaders, and now the state was prosecuting him for crimes committed during his conflict with those same leaders. The evidence against him came from Pavel Tikhomirov, the hunter, his own former contract killer. Tikhomirov had been arrested separately and, facing his own prosecution, had given a full confession. He described in detail how Maslennikov had ordered Bilkov's murder, how the killing had been planned over months, how Maslennikov had wanted to intimidate other criminal figures and maintain his image as a harsh leader. Tikhomirov confessed to being the triggerman and to participating in the failed assassination attempt on Sakhnov. His testimony was detailed, specific, and damning. On September 18, 2009, a team of Moscow police officers, accompanied by investigators from the Prosecutor General's Office for the Far Eastern Federal District, raided Maslennikov's Moscow residence. They found him there, living under his own name, despite being supposedly protected by the state. He was arrested and immediately transported to Khabarovsk to face charges. After spending years as a protected witness, living relatively freely while testifying against his former colleagues, Maslennikov found himself in Detention Facility No. 1 in Khabarovsk, the same city where he'd once ruled as criminal overseer. The charges were serious. Article 105 of the Russian Criminal Code: murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Article 222: illegal possession of weapons and ammunition, multiple counts, each carrying significant prison time. Prosecutors alleged that Maslennikov had organized at least two major criminal acts: the successful assassination of Bilkov and the failed hit on Sakhnov. They had Tikhomirov's confession, forensic evidence from the crime scenes, testimony from other participants. What made this development so remarkable was the legal gymnastics involved. Maslennikov had received immunity as a particularly important witness. That immunity was supposed to protect him from prosecution for crimes committed as part of the criminal organization he was testifying about. But prosecutors argued that the Bilkov murder and Sakhnov assassination attempt were personal crimes, not official Obshchak business, and therefore not covered by the immunity agreement. Whether this distinction made legal sense was debatable, but it didn't matter. Krab was in custody, and the state was prosecuting him. From his perspective, this must have felt like the ultimate betrayal. He'd risked everything to cooperate with the state. He'd violated the criminal code, destroyed his reputation in the underworld, helped dismantle an organization he'd been part of for over a decade. He'd sent former colleagues to prison for decades, and now the same prosecutors who'd promised him protection were throwing him in jail. The state had used him to destroy the Obshchak, and once that usefulness was exhausted, they'd turned on him. The case moved slowly through the legal system. Maslennikov's lawyers fought every aspect of the prosecution, arguing that the charges violated the immunity agreement, that the evidence was insufficient, that the state was acting in bad faith. The investigation dragged on for months, then years. Maslennikov remained in pretrial detention in Khabarovsk's SIZO No. 1, a harsh facility where conditions were deliberately difficult to encourage confessions and cooperation. But Maslennikov wasn't cooperating this time. According to sources close to the case, he maintained his innocence regarding the Bilkov murder and the Sakhnov assassination attempt. His lawyers argued that Tikhomirov's testimony was unreliable, obtained under pressure, tainted by the killer's own desire for a reduced sentence. They pointed out that Maslennikov had no prior criminal record, technically true since he'd never been convicted despite decades of criminal activity, and argued that the prosecution was politically motivated. 18 months. That's how long Yuri Maslennikov sat in Khabarovsk's detention facility, waiting for his case to go to trial. 18 months in a Russian SIZO, Следственный изолятор, a pretrial detention center where conditions are deliberately harsh. These aren't prisons designed for long-term incarceration. They're holding facilities where suspects await trial, often in overcrowded cells with minimal amenities, designed to break your spirit and encourage cooperation with prosecutors. For a man who'd once controlled an entire region's criminal activity, who'd lived in luxury funded by smuggling and extortion, the conditions must have been degrading. But something strange was happening with his case. The prosecution kept hitting obstacles. In December 2010, the Khabarovsk Regional Court extended Maslennikov's detention, ruling that he should remain in custody while the investigation continued. His lawyers immediately appealed this decision to Russia's Supreme Court, the highest judicial authority in the country. And on February 8, 2011, in a decision that shocked prosecutors and law enforcement officials, the Supreme Court ruled in Maslennikov's favor. The Supreme Court didn't just overturn the detention extension, they set bail. 3 million rubles, approximately $100,000 at 2011 exchange rates. A significant sum, but manageable for someone who'd run a criminal empire worth tens of millions annually. The justification cited the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically the principle that suspicion alone is insufficient to hold someone in detention. The court noted that Maslennikov had no prior criminal convictions, a technically accurate statement that ignored his decades of criminal activity, and that he'd shown willingness to cooperate with authorities by testifying against the Obshchak. The Prosecutor General's Office for the Far Eastern Federal District had already filed objections to extending Maslennikov's arrest before the Supreme Court ruling, expressing doubt about the strength of the case. This was remarkable. Prosecutors who'd been pursuing major organized crime figures were now saying they weren't confident about convicting one of those figures. Something had changed. Whether it was weakness in the evidence, political pressure, corruption, or genuine legal concerns remained unclear. But the result was undeniable. Krab was walking out of detention. The investigative committee, Russia's equivalent of the FBI, was furious. Spokesperson statements called the decision incomprehensible and vowed to appeal to the Supreme Court's Presidium, a higher appellate body. Alexander Bastrykin, head of the investigative committee and one of Russia's most powerful law enforcement officials, personally protested the decision. But the protests went nowhere. The Supreme Court's ruling stood. There was just one problem. Maslennikov couldn't immediately access the 3 million rubles to post bail. His assets had been seized during his conflict with the Obshchak. What money remained was tied up in accounts he couldn't easily access from detention. For nearly a week, according to reports, he had the legal right to be released, but nowhere to send the bail payment. Eventually, someone, sources don't specify who, which raises its own questions, provided the 3 million rubles. On February 17, 2011, after 18 months in detention, Yuri Maslennikov walked out of SIZO No. 1 in Khabarovsk. The prosecution's case should have proceeded to trial. Maslennikov was out on bail, not exonerated. The charges against him remained active. But then something unprecedented happened. The case was sent back for additional investigation. In Russian legal procedure, this is called returning the case to the investigative authorities, and it's supposed to happen when prosecutors find gaps in the evidence that need to be filled before trial. In June 2011, the Prosecutor General's Office sent Maslennikov's case back for additional investigation. The stated reason was insufficient evidence. Despite having Pavel Tikhomirov's detailed confession, despite forensic evidence from the Belkov murder scene, despite testimony from other participants, prosecutors claimed they couldn't prove Maslennikov's direct involvement in ordering the killings. This was baffling to many observers. Organized crime cases are built on exactly this kind of evidence: testimony from participants, circumstantial connections, patterns of behavior. If this evidence was insufficient, it was hard to see how any organized crime boss could ever be prosecuted. 6 months later, in January 2012, it happened again. The case came back from additional investigation. Prosecutors reviewed it and once again sent it back for more work. This was now the second return to investigators, an extremely unusual pattern. Each time, the prosecutor's office stated they found the evidence against Maslennikov's co-defendants sufficient to proceed. Several people involved in the actual execution of the crimes were prosecuted and convicted. But somehow, the evidence linking Maslennikov himself to ordering these crimes was inadequate. The investigative committee protested both returns. Bastrikin personally challenged the Prosecutor General's office decisions, arguing that the evidence was sufficient and that political or corrupt influences were protecting Maslennikov. But the Prosecutor General's office has independent authority over which cases proceed to trial, and they refused to move forward. The standoff between two of Russia's most powerful law enforcement agencies played out in bureaucratic maneuvering, while Maslennikov remained free. By 2014, when asked about the case, a representative from the investigative committee would only say that the case is not closed, but couldn't provide any timeline for resolution. And that's where the official record essentially stops. No trial, no conviction, no formal dismissal of charges. Just legal limbo. A case that exists in theory, but never proceeds in practice, while the defendant lives freely somewhere in Russia. Pavel Tikhomirov, the hunter, the contract killer whose confession had started the prosecution against Maslennikov, was convicted in 2009. The Khabarovsk Regional Court found him guilty of murdering Alexander Bilkov and attempting to murder Eduard Sakhnov. He'd confessed to both crimes, cooperated with investigators, and provided detailed testimony. For these acts, committed on Maslennikov's orders according to his own testimony, Tikhomirov received 11 years in a strict regime colony. The trigger man got 11 years. The man who allegedly ordered the killings got nothing. This outcome raised obvious questions about Russia's criminal justice system, about the influence of money and connections, about how someone like Maslennikov could apparently operate outside normal legal constraints. Various theories circulated. Some suggested he'd made a second deal with authorities, providing information about other criminal figures in exchange for the case against him being shelved. Others pointed to possible corruption, claiming Maslennikov had paid enormous bribes to ensure the case never proceeded. Still others suggested political protection, that he'd developed connections with powerful officials who shielded him from prosecution. What's documentable is that Maslennikov had demonstrable connections to Russia's security and political elite. In May 2018, these connections became briefly public in the most unusual way possible, through a helicopter crash. A private Sudaviation Gazelle helicopter made a hard emergency landing in Khabarovsk region. The landing was rough enough that the aircraft caught fire, though all passengers evacuated before the flames consumed the helicopter. One passenger, however, suffered a heart attack during the emergency and died. Lieutenant General Anatoly Yezhkov, retired deputy director of Russia's FSB, the federal security service that succeeded the KGB. Initial reports about the crash mentioned the helicopter's owner, Sergei Melnichenko, a businessman and co-owner of the Setishevsky production complex in Amur region. The story seemed straightforward: a business trip gone wrong, a tragic death of a retired general. But then, telegram channels and regional news sources revealed another passenger's name: Yuri Maslennikov. The former crime boss, supposedly lying low after escaping prosecution, had been on a fishing trip with a retired FSB general who'd held one of the highest positions in Russian intelligence. This wasn't some low-level connection. Yezhkov had been deputy director of the FSB, one of the most powerful positions in Russia's security apparatus. He would have had access to classified intelligence, connections throughout government, influence over law enforcement operations. and he was apparently friendly enough with Maslennikov to go on fishing trips together to remote regions. The implications were clear. Krab wasn't just some fugitive hiding in the shadows. He maintained relationships with the highest levels of Russia's power structure. The helicopter crash investigation revealed that Maslennikov had been living in Kolomna, a historic city in Moscow region, about 100 kilometers southeast of the capital. Far from Khabarovsk, far from the criminal empire he'd once controlled, living under his own name despite technically being under investigation for murder. No one was hunting him. No one was monitoring his movements. He was free to travel to Khabarovsk region for fishing trips, to live openly in Kolomna, to maintain friendships with retired FSB generals. The question that remains is, where is Yuri Maslennikov now, and what is he doing? The 2021 search placed him in Crimea, living in a substantial property, comfortable enough to own illegal firearms. But Crimea is a large peninsula, and the search was 3 years ago. He could still be there. He could have moved. He's in his late 50s now, old enough that the physical capabilities that made him useful as an enforcer in his youth are diminished, but young enough to potentially live decades more. Does he still have connections to criminal activity? It's hard to believe someone with his history and skills simply retired to quiet domesticity. But it's equally hard to see how he could operate openly in criminal circles, given his reputation as an informant. The label Krabovskaya, the Krab's people, remains an insult in Russian criminal slang, denoting traitors and snitches. No serious criminal organization would trust him. Perhaps he's found other ways to monetize his knowledge and connections: consulting, mediation, information brokerage, activities that stop short of direct criminal activity but leverage his experience and contacts. Does he fear retaliation? Sakhnov and the other Obshchak leaders are in prison, but criminal organizations have long memories. Contracts on informants can remain active for decades. Yet Maslennikov lives openly enough that searches at his residence make the news, that his presence on a helicopter with an FSB general gets reported. Either he's confident his connections protect him, or he's calculated that enough time has passed and enough people have been imprisoned that active threats are minimal. What does he think about his portrayal in Likie? The series depicts him as an intelligent, ruthless operator who ultimately survives through betrayal. It's not a flattering portrait, even if the character is compelling. Does he watch the show? Does he care about how millions of Russians now perceive him through this fictionalized version? Or has he compartmentalized his past, treating it as a finished chapter that has nothing to do with whoever he is now? These questions have no public answers. Maslennikov doesn't give interviews. He doesn't maintain social media. He doesn't publish memoirs or appear on documentary programs. The last substantial public information about him came from the 2021 search, and even that was fragmentary. Video footage of officers at his door, reports about a weapon found, speculation about why he was being questioned. Everything else is inference, rumor, and speculation. What we can say with certainty is this: Yuri Maslennikov, the former physical education teacher who became one of Russia's Far East's most powerful criminal figures, who ran smuggling operations worth millions, who ordered contract killings, who survived a war with Thieves-in-Law by betraying his entire organization, who was arrested for murder and then released without trial. He's alive, he's free, and he's escaped every consequence that logic suggests he should have faced. He represents a particular Russian phenomenon, the survivor who navigates between criminal world and state power, who violates every rule of both systems and somehow emerges untouched. He's not celebrated like some criminals who achieve folk hero status. He's not martyred like others who died violently or spent decades in prison. He's simply there, somewhere. A ghost who occasionally materializes in news reports before fading back into obscurity. The younger generation learning about him through Likie sees a dramatic character, a figure from Russia's chaotic transition period when everything seemed possible and rules meant nothing. But for people who lived in Khabarovsk during his reign, who paid protection money to his collectors, who knew people killed on his orders, who watched the streets run with blood during the criminal wars. He's something else. He's a reminder that violence often goes unpunished, that power and money can corrupt justice, that in Russia's system, connections sometimes matter more than law. Whether he lives out his remaining years in peace, or whether his past eventually catches up with him, remains to be seen. He's made enemies who will never forgive, committed crimes that have no statute of limitations morally, even if they do legally. The families of people killed on his orders, Alexander Belkov's relatives, the victims of protection rackets and smuggling operations, the people traumatized by the violence of that era, they remember. Memory is long, and justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. For now, though, Krab survives. The boxing instructor who became a crime boss, who ordered murders and ran smuggling networks, who betrayed an entire criminal organization and somehow avoided prison. He's out there, somewhere, living proof that in certain systems, under certain circumstances, you really can get away with murder. Whether that's a comment on Russia's legal system, on the value of cooperation with authorities, on corruption, or simply on the chaos of a particular historical moment, each observer can decide for themselves. The story of Yuri Maslennikov doesn't have a satisfying ending because it doesn't have an ending at all. It just continues, unresolved, somewhere in the gray spaces between criminal underworld and legitimate society, between prosecution and freedom, between past and present. And perhaps that ambiguity, that refusal to conform to narrative expectations of justice or consequences, is the most Russian thing about it.